All right. Welcome and thank you for being here. This is our FCI live session on startup food co-ops and the next chapter. And I am excited to have you here with me. And we're going to dive right on into this topic. But before we do so, just really quick, I do want to thank our champion level sponsors this year, which are Cabot Creamery Co-op, Frontier Co-op, and National Co-op Grocers. And they make this whole series possible, and especially make it possible for us to make this entire series free to all cooperators across the US. So thank you very deeply to them for making this series possible. Real quick, who I am before we get into our topic today about the fourth wave of food cooperation. I am JQ Hanna. It says interim. I forgot to fix that. I am the permanent executive director of Food Co-op Initiative since October. So I'm with Food Co-op Initiative. We're a tiny nonprofit that nationally supports the startup food co-op movement now, and we are actually entering our 21st year. And so some real important things maybe to know as you listen to this session. I am not an academic. I'm not from an academic background. I'm from a GM food co-op background. And while I've been doing this startup work now for 11 years and have been in the natural foods industry directly in retail before that for about 15 years, this is not coming from an academic perspective. So keep that in mind. Thank you for being here with me. What you can expect from this session. This is a big topic, and to be honest, it's the beginning of a much bigger conversation that FCI cannot lead alone. Food Co-op Initiative is not going to lead all by ourselves. We hope to kick off a conversation. It'll be an incomplete but sweeping history of the U.S. food cooperative movement and where your startup might fits into that. And what Food Co-op Initiative means by fourth wave of startup food co-op or grocery co-op organizing and what makes it unique. Why suddenly saying that we're in a fourth wave rather than the third wave that we've been in since the early 2000s. That's what you can expect to hear covered today, and it will spawn a ton of questions and more conversations, and many of which will happen throughout the rest of this series. Please do check out those sessions and those videos, but this will kick that off. All right. So, real quickly, just a minute, where these concepts came from. You're going to be hearing concepts. I'm going to reference more than one that are not my own. I'm going to do my very best I can to reference which of those are not mine, where they came from. But I will also be sending out to all of you a reference document or a resources document within 24 hours of this session that will have links and ref to all the references and some suggested bonus sources of information that will hopefully connect you to source some of these concepts came from that were not directly FCIs. All right. I have 60 minutes to cover this fourth wave. So those of you who are here with me today, thank you to all of you cooperators. I did focus in on what would be valuable to the startup food co-ops that are currently organizing in this moment. So if you are a food co-op historian or long timer and you have information that I didn't share here, I get it. I had 55 minutes. I did not share all of it. Much of it very valuable and could contribute to the conversation, but we tried to narrow it down to what we can get through in this amount of time to kick off the conversation and that would help frame it for those who are active startup food co-op organizers today. So let's get started. We're here to talk today about the fourth wave of grocery food co-op startups in the US. And you're also going to hear me specifically say grocery co-ops rather than food co-ops alone. So I use those terms interchangeably. But I focus a lot on grocery because we're talking mostly about retail food cooperation. The waves have building phases of organize lots of co-ops organizing food co-ops, a peak of amount of people who are organizing, and then they tend to you see a releasing phase as a new phase of food cooperation focus begins. And so this is a pretty good metaphor. It's not mine. So the dates on here of when new food co-ops were organizing, first off, you see the 1930s wave, the 1970s wave on this slide, and the 2000s wave. That's trying to label kind of the peak of when that organizing was happened, but it had an uprise and a down, and we'll be talking about that. But where did this language even come from? The waves of food co-op organizing and fourth wave food cooperation. There are two key resources I do want to name at the beginning of this session. Remember, I said I'm not a trained researcher, nor do I have the time to be a researcher as much as I'd like to be. But to the best of my knowledge I could find, Walden Swanson and Kate Sundberg started defining the waves of food cooperation in the early 2000s, and then solidified that language really entirely, started making presentations on it around 2011. And I can find no other reference to the idea of waves of cooperative organizing, much less food cooperation organizing. We're going to get deeper into some of Kate and Walden's ideas later in the session, but they are a core source just for this language about waves of food cooperation, which is incredibly useful and helpful. The other resource I want to really point to that, and I'll be sending this link to you on the document, is both the book Collective Courage by Dr. Jessica Gordon Nebhart, as well as an interview with Dr. Jessica with NPQ magazine, talking about 10 years in after writing her first version of her book, where she sees Black cooperative organizing at this time. The fourth wave of Black cooperative organizing in the US and the fourth wave of the grocery co-op organizing in the US are deeply interwoven, but they are not the same thing. We'll come back to that. But a lot of this, the use of the fourth wave language was definitely emerging, if not first came up in Black-led organizing because of Dr. Jessica Gordon Nebhart. Okay. So stages are waves one, two, and three. Let's understand real quickly, to the best of our knowledge, the waves of U.S. grocery co-op organizing in the U.S. as they are currently labeled. And so we're going to get into, and I was real quickly I have to point, that is a picture of on this slide of Suncoast Co-op Market, which was the 190th startup grocery co-op that has opened since Food Co-op Initiative has existed. They just opened their doors earlier this year. So the first wave of food cooperation in the US was labeled by Sundberg and Swanson as the 1930s. And were there no co-ops selling food before that? No, there definitely were. The modern concept of the grocery store, though, is one store that contained many categories of food, was self-serve, was almost exclusively selling only food, began really in the early 1900s and truly arrived in the 1930s. And there's great books about the grocery industry that cover that. But this concept of the modern grocery store, we kind of see that solidify both in US culture in general and cooperative culture around the 1930s. So Sundberg and Swanson called that the first wave of grocery co-op organizing. I still find it a little odd we don't consider the 1890s the first wave. There's the concept of the grocery store of a grocer at least existed, and there were cooperative grocers. But there were actually a lot more cooperative food businesses that were not grocers, but that were bakeries or dairies or so forth during that phase, so maybe that's why. The second wave was in the early 1970s and grew out of multiple things, out of a powerful moment when decades of Black-led civil rights organizing, the Yellow Power movement, disability justice action, LGBTQ organizing, and youth organizing against the Vietnam War all converged into one moment. And then the third wave of grocery co-op organizing took many by surprise, being the most unique amongst the wave in some ways that we'll be discussing in just a little bit, and came up, it was kind of really formally seeing it starting to happen around 2005. So going back to the Sundberg-Swanson image I showed you earlier, they called this pattern they found in the rise and fall of grocery co-ops, actually, they said these are waves, but they called it the we-me cycle. The grocery co-op organizing of the 1930s emerged after a stock market crash of the 1929s and the start of the Great Depression, while in the 1960s marked a decade of seemingly established or even shrinking wealth gap. But it actually hit an economic gutting of rural communities as well as urban Black communities from both the Green Revolution and many societal pressures that were going on within our culture that was kind of hiding below that surface. So this coincided with 50% of the population at that time being under 30 and the early successes of Black civil rights movement. These things came together and kind of formulated what we call the second wave of food co-op organizing. And Sundberg and Swanson called this a we cycle. They assert that the US public swings strongly toward working together and social justice during these times, and that me cycles that they saw in the 1950s and the 1980s was when public energy was refunneled into basically greed is good, self-focused beliefs and behaviors. That was actually greed is good quote was a quote from Swanson. I would love to have a whole session to poke at this idea and to talk more in detail about the factors of these. I think there's some missing personally, and I'm sure you've got opinions on it too. But we have a lot to get through here. This concept, though, was developed in 2012 and shows a true pattern in food co-op organizing. Droves organize, so droves organize, many open, many close, and then some adapt, change, and move with the times and actually thrive and continue on and even maybe grow in the volume of food that they're selling in the communities that they're serving. So, real quick, the 1930s. Much of the history is hard to find or even fully lost to time, but the resource doc that I'll send you does list a book called What Happened to the Berkeley Co-op, which is a book that actually wrote up about what happened in detail according to the organizers of this 1930s, 1940s food cooperative that lasted for a long time. And they're some of the largest and most successful grocery co-ops of this era did last for a good long time. Only a few of them are still with us today. It's also another place where I'd say take a look at Dr. Jessica's Collective Courage book, which is the best history of critical Black co-op organizing knowledge out there that we have, and goes into detail about this era too. There was absolutely no surprise. We didn't talk about it. It's not been well recorded for obvious reasons that it has disappeared more to history. There was a lot of Black-led food co-op organizing, grocery co-op organizing going on at that time. And we'll go a little more into that in a sec. But rapidly evolving, so there were what made these co-ops? These co-ops were predominantly what we would call conventional food today. There was no such concept at the time. There was no organic, there was no natural, there was no local, there was no conventional. There was food, there was grocery. And so these were mainstream grocery stores in a lot of ways. They were trying to meet the same needs of any other grocery store out there. And what happened? Well, there are four factors we're going to hear about. You're going to hear them again, that are pointed to. We all weren't there. Again, spotty history. But what is pointed to is rapidly evolving and growing private corporate competition. We think of that as a now thing. This is not a new thing in the US culture. That there were corporate entities were moving into, in large or privately owned businesses were moving into dominating the grocery field, opening more stores, but also the sourcing of the food. And this was happening very rapidly during this 30s, 40s period. So they just was a lot of competition. Struggle to manage a business with thin margins in an industry where best practices were constantly changing. This is often just pointed to as management problems, bad management problems. People were struggling, as is sound familiar to many of us now, with the fact that the business best practices for such a narrow margin industry were constantly evolving and the playing field was being constantly changed. And so, yeah, management issues, management mistakes absolutely are a big part of why a lot of these co-ops aren't with us today. Also, though, was often pointed to access to capital. This is brought up constantly in the cooperative world. Some of these co-ops just struggled to get access to capital at key times to bridge them over as they continue to evolve and grow to meet the times and people's needs. And then I added number 4, which I would say, and I'm not sure many would disagree with me, but it hasn't seen listed too much. And I'd say planned concentrated social pressure away from the we behavior that was going on when co-ops were formulating in this period coming out of the Great Depression. In this case, in good part, the Red Scare, which if you've read your history, quite literally, if you take a look, cooperatives were one of the things most targeted as anti-American. And it was really good reasons for this. This really worked very, very well for business interests and corporations at the time. And that fear of that and that reprogramming of what we think of as what we want to participate in, what is American, especially as you're going into a war, really has powerful effects again and again and again upon the decisions we make and how we focus our energies. So real quick, the second wave of the 1970s, there are more historical sources here that I will be putting in the resources doc that I especially recommend, again, Collective Courage and the documentary called The Co-op Wars. You can find it easily in an online search for it, and you can rent it for $5. Wave started in the late 1960s, and some of the earliest ones we can find reference to were Black-led and rural, both. like the North Boulevard County Farm Cooperative, which actually owned 12 stores and a distribution system. This is recent research that's coming out about them, and more keep coming out. So we don't hear about this much in the food co-op movement, but it absolutely was really and was active at the beginning, possibly the inspiration and a learning place of a lot of food co-ops of this 1970s wave. Many food co-ops of this wave were organized as part of the civil rights movement for economic independence and to meet community food needs above all else. This was, of course, in predominantly Black communities, and a lot of them in the South, very strongly in the South. And then at the same time, many predominantly white young adult-led grocery co-ops formed as a response to the corporate food system and injustice of those food systems and injustice in the world around them, very focused on organic food, clean of pesticides. This was not that long after Silent Spring came out, that book that talked about what pesticides were doing to our environment and to our bodies. And they were focused on also local farms and local foods because, again, there was a huge die-off of U.S. small farms in the 1960s caused by the Green Revolution, and they were also responding to that. So, what caused the loss of most of these food co-ops? If you're looking on the left, the red line there, that is the 1940s, 1930s wave of first food co-op wave of organizing. The line is co-ops organizing and then dropping off. And the pink hill is the economic power, the amount of dollars are going through these co-ops, according to Sundberg and Swanson. The green line is that second wave. And so you see this massive peak. It really peaked in the early 1970s, but started in the late 1960s, continued through the late 1970s, but that peak was really in the early 1970s. And then we lost a lot of food co-ops. It is estimated generously that 50% of second wave food co-ops opened and survived this phase. But I think that's extremely generous, and a lot of folks think 25% is far more accurate because we find more and more and more lost history of food co-ops from this 1970s second wave. The ones that did survive, as far as we know, were 100% predominantly white-led, with a focus on access to non-corporate, local, and organic food. An exception, and I know you guys know some exceptions. Throw the exceptions in the comments. Email me. Remember, I'm not a historian, but I want to hear about it. I know I'm going to get some things wrong here, but you'll see a picture here of the Bryant Food Co-op. And the Bryant Food Co-op in Minneapolis became Seward Food Co-op. And actually, their second store, their Friendship store, opened in a historically Black community, opened just down the block from where the Bryant Food Co-op's original location had been. But that is the same food co-op. But they are an exception. The vast majority of the second wave today, actually, as far as we know, up to very close to 100%, were food co-ops that were focused on local, organic, were focused on bulk foods, were focused on getting food from farms, and getting things like quinoa, tofu, getting this alternative food for their physical health, for the earth's health, for the health of farm systems, and that's who mostly, not all those survived by far. Again, 50% to 75% of them disappeared after the 1970s or at some point in the 70s. But that second wave continued. Those who continued and survived, they evolved. They didn't get through the 1980s and 1990s by doing exactly what they did in the 1970s. Grocery was evolving, the economy was changing, the way people behave was changing. And so they transformed to something that still was rooted in their same values, but had very different retail realities. They became the vanguard of organic and local food retailing in the US, and they changed how we eat. How second wave grocery co-ops evolved is important to see here because it is what the second wave grocery co-ops evolved into in the 1990s and aughts that actually informs our third wave. All right, so if we look at the first and second wave of grocery co-op organizing and the unnamed 1990s, 1890s wave as well, the sudden rise of organizing is generally connected to three factors. So oppression or exploitation of a group of people, intense economic pain being pushed down onto people or communities with less power, and or intense consolidation of corporate control. Remember, even back in the 1930s, that was a named thing that they were fighting back against intense consolidation of corporate control of their economic lives and their communities. So these three factors were consistent as we knew in the waves, that they all took some major part in why people started organizing food co-ops. They came out of times of intense unrest and intense injustice and oppression. That has always been the MO of co-ops, including the Rochdale co-ops. I'm not going to get into the Rochdale co-ops today from England, but if you want to look up the history of the Rochdale co-ops, that is the beginning of the modern idea of the consumer co-op owned by the community as a legal structure. All right. So, and why did the ones that fail? Same reasons I listed number one are always in wave one are always listed for wave two. The same reasons of competition was evolving and changing rapidly. How you manage these grocery stores, gosh, it was tough. And so there was a lot of management failure, just not having the skills and knowledge to stay ahead, and some just poor mismanagement at times, lack of access to capital, and I would say again, those social pressures. Now, looking at the third wave. As I said at the beginning, the third wave is something really kind of unique. It's got some real differences from those first two named waves, and I would say that predecessor wave from the 1890s. There was real consistencies between those three. Something's a little different here. It isn't, and we are considered now in the beginning of, or in not in the middle, toward the end of the third wave of food co-op organizing. FCI was formed in 2005 as Co-op 500 at the very beginning of this wave. So this wave started in the mid 2000s. We don't see a lot of activity before that, couple in the early 2000s. It was a surprise. Only a handful of new grocery co-ops had organized and opened in the 80s and 90s. These now established food co-ops from the 1970s who had evolved and grown and were vibrant and in the natural, what is sadly was considered the natural food industry of the time, they didn't see this coming really. And yeah, because we hadn't seen a lot of organizing, but why else was it a surprise? Well, the first wave again came out of poor and working class people of all races during the Great Depression fighting for food access and just basic economic survival and justice. The second wave, there were a lot of global majority communities, predominantly black and young, predominantly white areas as well, with these are major college student areas, learning from the civil rights movement, and all of them activating against a lot of unjust situations that they were facing and seeing food, this common basic right, as a power center that they could move the dial on to make the future better for their communities. So who was organizing the third wave? Was Third wave was predominantly white, predominantly midlife and middle class. These were not predominantly people in their 20s, not even 30s, predominantly their 40s and older, and predominantly well into their careers and in the middle class. Not saying wealthy, saying middle class though, and that was very, very different. That was not known as a people who started waves of grocery co-op organizing. This was unusual. So what's that about? Well, real quickly, these are some of the amazing and impactful third wave startup grocery stores across the US, many of whom have mentored third wave startup grocery co-ops after them. When you look at these pictures, these beautiful stores inside and out, and they look like what? They look just like the thriving second wave grocery co-ops from the 1970s that made it through the 1980s and 90s and are thriving today. And there's a reason for that. The core reasons for organizing a new grocery store are still similar. They wanted good, safe food that was grown in a way that doesn't harm their community nor anyone who produces it. They wanted a place to shop that strengthens their community and their community connections. They wanted businesses that they have control over that don't exist to exploit our food needs to get extractive profit. That instead, that anything that our business that we pay to get our food fuels a better community and a better world. These things are consistent among food co-ops that have organized in every wave. But they had a very, very specific concept of how they wanted it done. The most common, so again, FCI, Food Co-op Initiative, my organization, we started into around 2005. And so we have been with the entire third wave of food co-op organizing. And while there's different things said on those first calls to us when people called and go, I think we might want to organize a co-op grocery store. One of the most common things that was said to us over and over again until about 2017, 2018, like probably the thing we expected on almost every single call from a community that wanted to start to work on building a co-op grocery was, in some point of it, I lived in Ithaca and was a member of Green Star in college. I want to bring that here. We are near Briar Patch Co-op, and our community wants that here. We are actually in the suburbs outside of Weaver Street Co-op, and we want that here. I visited this co-op once in California, and I want that here. What was this thing they wanted? When they pointed to those co-ops, they said, "What is it they wanted?" I want a co-op like that one. First off, no co-op grocery stores had survived long enough, very, very few, for people to point to it later after the end of their wave and say of organizing and say, "We want that." So that was unusual in of itself that there were so many thriving cooperative grocery stores to point to. Um, but they were also pointing to a very specific, what we call a business concept. So what you're going to see over here on the left is the top of the Food Co-op Development Framework that you'll find on the FCI website, which is just a framework of best practices of how you organize a grocery co-op that in any size community, of any size, of any product mix. These are some of the best practices of organizing that you're going to go through. And the thing that caps it off is always the vision, why you're doing this. Why are you running this food co-op? Why do you want to put in all these years of work, all this capital, time and money capital into creating this co-op? And the idea is that you bring why you want to do it together with business realities of your community through a lot of study and work, and you develop a business concept. There are many different ways you can open a co-op grocery store. It can be really tiny, it can be really big, it could be open part of the week and focused entirely on produce. It could be what we call a full service grocery store with all departments. There's all different we could focus heavily on prepared foods. It could have no prepared foods, depending on the needs of the community and what is business possible in that community. And what we design is the way we're going to deliver the business, how big it's going to be, what's going to be on the shelves. That's called the business concept now. And this is a concept that was newly named in the framework process. And when I give a special nod, especially to the framework editors team that came up with this term, and James Morrell and Heather Lazakas especially. And it names something we've never named before, which is there's a way to organize a food co-op, but that food co-op could be many different kinds of businesses. The business concept of being a natural food store that looks a certain way, that's not the model for food co-op organizing. That's the business concept for delivering that organizing around your values to have a cooperative grocery store. And so when third wave food co-ops were calling us and pointing, say, like that co-op, like that co-op, when we questioned them about what parts they were looking for, what they meant often was they were looking for USDA organic and natural foods. They wanted foods that were clean, sustainable, that weren't harming them, the communities they were being grown in. They wanted a big focus, growing focus, actually, I think it was higher in the third wave, on local farmers and producers and supporting and revitalizing local food networks and farms. And then a beautiful third space in the community where we can actually connect with one another. So they were looking for a very specific business concept that actually had come out of the second wave food co-ops and what they'd evolved into, all the works and decades they had put in to becoming leaders in the natural food industry. All right. So when I say, so why? The why of why people were organizing food co-ops in third wave is unique because it was not based on oppression and exploitation of a group of people predominantly. I'm not saying it was never a factor, but it was definitely not a predominant factor. It was not in good part because of intense economic pain being pushed down onto other people or communities. It was mostly to replicate what the second wave had built. That they also said, this is amazing. And what they're doing for we're doing for the communities, for the food system is amazing. We want this in our community. And it was led predominantly by middle class and midlife white people. Again, predominantly, not always. We'll talk about that more. So The fourth wave. Why are we talking about that now, and how is it different than this third wave we just named? Now remember, FCI, Food Co-op Initiative, was formulated to buy second wave food co-ops that had survived the 1980s and 90s and thrived to support this developing third wave of food co-ops who mostly were calling us saying we want to do what they're doing. There was a lot of knowledge about how to do that, although it was a very different time to start a grocery co-op, to start any grocery business, than when these second wave co-ops had done it. So they knew they were going to need help. So what's so different now? The second wave started in 2005. We've been in this second wave. Well, first off, historically so far, waves of co-op grocery organizing usually last about, I mean, the real peak of it lasts about 10 years. And the peak, so it kind of it's coming up. We can see it. Lots and lots of communities organizing, decent amount of stores opening, and then that wow, everybody wants a co-op grocery store, and then it's slowing down a little. That's usually like a 10-year cycle. And if we think of the third wave, I'm sorry, of food co-op organizing starting around 2005, maybe even say 2007 to be generous, we should have seen that waning by 2017, but we weren't. And the fourth wave, I've come to believe, is a big reason of why. Let's talk about who the fourth wave is. This is the beginning of a conversation about who the fourth wave is first. Food Co-op Initiative can't define the fourth wave for the fourth wave because they're the ones living it and it is still on the rise and defining itself. But as a starting point, Food Co-op Initiative did notice by 2017 that who was calling us was changing. While we were definitely still getting calls from communities that wanted second wave business concept product mixes in stores, the trend was slowly decreasing by 2017. We were noticing this. At the same time, though, the number of calls in organizing community was not decreasing. So if that's decreasing, if we're slowly seeing a downward trend in 2017 of those who want to organize to build very similar to second wave current stores, then who was it? We were getting a lot more calls from what we call remote rural communities. USDA rural can include some pretty large communities that actually are not very isolated from grocery options. And by remote rural, we are referring more to communities that are a good 20-minute drive away from any other grocery options. And it was remote rural communities who were losing grocery stores left and right that people were retiring from running. They were closing down inside their communities, making it necessary to drive 20 minutes or more to get any groceries. None of the chains wanted to come there. No one would help them. And then also at the same time, historically red line communities were arising and calling us as well. And this was quickly becoming on track to be a third of who was calling us. We're going to talk about where that came from and why, but we really saw a giant uptick in this when Renaissance Food Co-op, those of you who knew Renaissance Co-op Grocery, forgive me, organized, and they opened in 2016. That was a Black-led co-op developed with the support of a nonprofit that tried to center the community and creating the solution they decided they wanted to the fact that grocery stores were leaving them in droves too and had been for 15, 17, 20 years. And their communities were sick of trying to lure in chains that were just refusing to come back and who were closing stores that were actually profitable in their communities, just not profitable enough. It was more profitable for us to go put a grocery store out here in this far more affluent community, buy all the highways so everyone could come in because we know you'll go there and shop when you don't have other options, but we can draw more money in from more regions. And we don't care if there's a grocery store in your community. We don't care if there's a grocery store in your neighborhood. We don't care what that does. In some ways, these remote rural communities and these historically redline communities in large cities were facing a similar, see you later from the grocery industry and their lack of interest in helping them or supporting them. And that's always where co-ops have come in, from electric co-ops to financial co-ops to food co-ops. So by 2018, 2019, in this supposed third wave of food co-op organizing, I suppose that's all we're in still, we were past that 10 years and we're seeing the number of people calling not decreasing, but we're on track for a third of who is calling and who is organizing that we are aware of, at least at Food Co-op Initiative, being in remote rural communities, a third of them being in historically redline communities in large cities, and a third of them still being in mostly college town communities and looking to build the second wave style business concept food co-op. The fourth wave, though, is made up of, and so we saw this change in who the wave was, but what was happening was the fourth wave was inputting into the third wave. And like sometimes happens, you don't see right away and name a wave, but especially because these waves were happening in the same time period together. And it gets that real quick and then they. But why were these fourth wave co-ops suddenly organizing? And by fourth wave, I'm now saying remote rural communities, historically redlined communities. Why were they organizing? Well, they bring back to center the tenant and leading force of every grocery startup co-op movement before it, before at least before the third wave, which is demand for quality, affordable food as a right that is being denied them, and building economic community power within a system that is purposely draining them far above the rate at which other communities are being drained for that system's profit. So this tenet we saw, it was, I would say, is very present in the 1890s, in the first wave in the 1930s. We saw in the 1960s of why people were forming grocery cooperatives is back. It was strangely absent from the third wave. The third wave was an attempt to take something amazing that had come out of a earlier food co-op movement and bring it to more communities and continue to expand it and grow it, and was very powerful. This was something else. This was going back to, we need cooperatives because we're being denied our basic human rights, because we're being oppressed, because we're lacking opportunities, because we need to do this ourselves. All right. So there are no tried and tested business concepts yet for fourth wave communities. Fourth wave communities are innovators. They are borrowing from many things that they've learned from second wave food co-ops and third wave food co-ops, and their business concept where appropriate. Absolutely. Because the great thing was, and we're going again, is that these waves, the third wave was and still is strong as the fourth wave is coming up. And so there was this opportunity to see, oh, there's something going on over there. There's conferences, there's tools, there's people working on this. And so well, let's see what of this applies in our communities. But they are overall innovators. They're well aware that they are borrowing some ideas from an existing movement, but they are doing something different. And what's going to work in their communities is different, and their reasons for doing it. Many of them, the most important thing is affordable food. So there's a lot of thinking about conventional food. And Gem City Market in Dayton, Ohio, and Flint Food Co-op in Flint, Michigan, have opened both in the last 4 or 5 years with entirely conventional, just a little tiny bit not, but really conventional food product mix. People are going to find on the shelves the brands they're used to seeing at any Kroger or Walmart or so forth, along with some other local organic or more natural products. But it's predominantly going to look like a conventional grocery store. That's not something those of us who are in the second, who've ever run a second wave food co-op or worked in that in the natural foods industry through food co-ops, that's not something we knew how to do. There was definitely some trying to mix in some of that product to meet community needs, mostly starting in the aughts. And there were some successes and some failures, but never being, very slowly eking up to maybe 50% of the product mix, but usually quite a bit less. Still that heavy focus on natural, local, and organic. So this is new, and we don't know. We don't have any tried or true models. The third wave food costs, we can say this works. You want this? Great. Let's test what we know works there as a business concept. Let's test it in a market study. Let's test it in a pro forma. We know what kind of margins it's going to get. We know we know so much about this. Let's put this together and see if it'll work in your community. The fourth wave doesn't have that. They absolutely can borrow some things and learn some things from the second and third wave, but they are trying to do something different in communities that are facing far different and far higher challenges, predominantly. So the fourth wave, I would say, is really so far, and again, this is the beginning of a conversation. Food Co-op Initiative is not trying to find for the fourth wave who the fourth wave is, but this is what we're seeing. The fourth wave, again, we're going to loosely say started around 2016, and we pin that strongly to when the Renaissance Cooperative Grocery in Greensboro, North Carolina opened. And that's a photo of them on the left. There are incredible resources out there about their organizing and their closure and what caused it, but also they not only the opening of their store, which was amazing, and the way they organized and it was different to what they were trying to do for their community was different, but they seeded an entire Black-led cooperative grocery co-op movement. Dozens of startup Black-led co-ops in predominantly Black communities have spawned from often hearing about Renaissance. And so we saw Renaissance, and there were others that were organizing at that time in predominantly Black-led communities. I'm looking at you, Detroit, and I'm looking at you, Fertile Ground Food Co-op, and Raleigh. But this was an explosion. The year, we started to see year after year now more and more and more and more like just getting started, Black-led startups showing up to the national conference up and coming for startup food co-ops, forming their own groups. We'll talk about in a minute to work on what they could learn from Renaissance, what they were going to do different. There was an explosion of really powerful, innovative Black-led food cooperation that was happening, and we pinned that back mostly to the start being around when Renaissance opened. And again, this is a loose attempt. Happy to hear feedback. There's on the right this other piece that's coming into that wave, this other piece that's building of waters that are building up this wave. And that's actually mostly, not only, but mostly Midwest and upper Midwest and the Plain States, very remote rural co-op organizing, grocery co-ops. And they were doing something very different. They were organizing at the same time, but they were less likely to be interacting with the mainstream startup co-op, grocery co-op movement, although they definitely were. But they're kind of going, we're being told you got to do this big fancy store. You got to have this kind of sales per square feet. We're going to throw some Metro shelves into this building and get a couple of used coolers, and we're going to get together and build this store because we need groceries here. It doesn't have to be sexy day one. It doesn't have to be the most stunning, beautiful thing you've ever seen. And we certainly might have some interest in organic, but mostly we just want food here, and we'd love to support the farmers around us and have local food here. And there are some very innovative things happening. Some of these stores being local foods only, locally sourced, mostly buying club, but with a storefront. Some were conventional foods, but and we're gonna try and do what we need to do to serve our communities. Cool. We can learn from what the second and third wave, which are natural food co-op focused, have done, but we're trying to solve a different situation, and what we want might look very different. And that wasn't really being acknowledged at the beginning of the fourth wave. And then there's a hidden third tributary, not so hidden, that has emerged that at least, and maybe it has definitely always been there, emerged to our vision, again, our ability to see, which is co-ops that are both Black-led and that are remote rural. And this is happening almost, as far as we know, almost exclusively in the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast. This is happening. Mostly we're seeing this in Georgia. We're seeing this in the Carolinas. This is a little bit of it up in Ohio and a few other places, but it's happening predominantly in this region. And one of the leaders I would say to look at there are co-ops like the West Georgia Farmer Cooperative, which has been an active Black-led farmer cooperative for small farmers in rural Georgia, in the western part of the state for decades, that is now building a food cooperative. But they're not the only ones. And so there is this emerging trend of predominantly Black communities and rural communities that are developing food cooperatives. So I want to point real quick that before the fourth wave, the 1940s, or that's supposed to be the 1930s wave happened, and we lost most of those stores, and a very small handful, lasted into the 70s and 80s and 90s, and they definitely passed on what knowledge they could to the 1970s wave, but there was very little overlap. The 1970s food co-op wave happened, huge, massive, and then we see, at least in organizing, there's basically the organizing pauses. We don't see new food co-ops organizing, just a tiny handful in the 80s and 90s. They just don't see it. And then 2000 starts. What's really, really unique right now is that, and I want to point to this, the 1970s second co-op wave co-ops that evolved to continue to serve and meet a changing world and a changing grocery industry saw the future. They said food co-ops from the past and from our recent past fail because we struggle with management knowledge and collecting that management knowledge and training. And we struggle with purchasing prices because now we're seeing lots of consolidation of food sourcing. And they formed the National Co-op Grocers that still exists today as a purchasing and services co-op to consolidate knowledge, to share knowledge and purchasing power. They also formed Food Co-op Initiative in 2005 and said, people are calling us wanting food co-ops. We don't want them to start from nothing like we did. We're going to form an organization that will be answering the phones, connecting the resources, and collecting knowledge and best practices rapidly, handing them back out to the movement so they don't have to crash. They also formed finance organizations. Remember that lack of access to capital we talked about in previous waves and that they had dealt with themselves in the second wave. They formed the Cooperative Fund of New England, Shared Capital Cooperative, and others that were specifically CDFIs, funding or institutions that were formed in the 1970s to fund cooperatives. And most of these in the beginning, food cooperatives in good part. And these organizations still thrive and fund startup food co-ops today. And then the wisdom and all the knowledge of the second wave co-ops that were predominantly Black-led, that were and part of the civil rights movement, consolidated in many ways and came forward as well to serve the next generation. The National Black Food and Justice Alliance, and those elders who were there in the 60s and 70s helped to form as they saw this wave of Black food cooperation forming in the early 2000s. They said, we need an organization to support this and to keep moving. Now, the National Black Food and Justice Alliance does more than just cooperative organizing, but is a central piece of what they do and have supported ever since their formation. And then we have amazing scholars like Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nebhart. And now I'm seeing additional young scholars coming forward who are studying specifically the Black cooperative grocery movement. She's studying the Black cooperative movement in general, but there's one actually coming out of my hometown here, the University of Illinois, who is specifically just studying food cooperatives and their role in the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s and uncovering new information that I have never seen before. And that's happening right now. So the 1970s wave found its way through its elders, through its survivors, through those who had been there to say, we're going to do something different this time. We saw the wave crash and we don't want that to happen again. We want to absolutely nourish the next generation. We want more of them to stay successful. We want more of them to stay open. So this is the beginning of a conversation when it comes to the fourth wave. Which business concepts are going to work in their community? That's not a cut and dried answer like it was. Those of us who were helping startups in the third wave, and some of you who are still third wave style food co-ops, the third wave is not over. It is coming down and the fourth wave is rising, but it is still powerful, and all cooperative food co-ops are all approaching the same problems and values from different angles, and they're all bringing great value to our society. But we knew, we're like, this is basically the business concept. Here you go. It was still really hard and expensive, but we had a model for what business concept was likely going to work because we were modeling it on successful second wave food co-ops. In this point, fourth wave food co-ops are like, we are going to have to do what the second wave had to do, what the first wave had to do, what they had to do in the 1890s, which is figure it out. There's a lot of factors. There's a lot of things happening, lots of different pieces that changing in the grocery industry and how we source food in farming and the economics of our communities in gentrification, in the isolation of rural communities, you name it, happening right now. We are in the pressure cooker for fourth wave communities and everything is changing. What will work here? Well, they will have support, have had and will have support from all the institutions that were built by the second wave and strengthened by the third wave, by all their peers in second wave and third wave style food co-ops that are still thriving today. They're the ones who are going to be answering this question. And then it's not going to be as simple, but food co-ops and cooperative groceries have done it before numerous times when there wasn't clear answers. Their third wave was an unusual situation, and it was a really wonderful one. And it's led, actually in many ways, nourished so many food co-ops that are for the future. The second wave continues to nourish and move us forward. But this isn't an answer that we're going to come up with. This is the beginning of a conversation. The fourth wave has brought new knowledge, innovation, and leadership to our movement. They've strengthened third wave business concepts focused startups as well. And established food co-ops alike from the second wave. It is predominantly, I showed this really big arrow here with Renaissance because it is there is a lot, especially to the actual central movement where people are interacting. Black leadership has contributed massive amounts to this fourth wave. They are leading it. They are innovating within it. But it's not that the rural co-ops are not. The rural co-ops are still looking, in a lot of ways, I think, to be respected and seen within the startup food co-op movement. And there's work to be done there, but they are doing some really brilliant, innovative things as well. One thing I can say though is I don't know if ever before we've all been in the same room at the same moment trying to solve different problems in different communities and moving forward together. This is a photo from the up and coming Startup Food Conference. This is 2024. I couldn't find the 2025 photo the other day. It exists. But in this room, lots of rural and isolated rural communities organizers are in this room. Many powerful Black-led co-op organizers are in this room. And many, of course, third wave who are doing the second wave business concept store leaders in this room. And they're all in community. They're in the same rooms. They're sharing concepts. They're sharing ideas. And we are truly becoming stronger together. And it's never happened in history like this ever before. All right, we have a few minutes for a couple of questions that are in the comments. Thank you. Some of the clearest, yeah, absolutely. And this is the beginning of us understanding the difference in the waves. And also, again, I want to point again that while FCI was noticing this and trying to put a name to it, Black-led co-op organizing was already naming it as well. So this is a kind of a confluence. It's not just us, but thank you for the compliment. John Stein in the Grocery Story has a chapter on the food co-op waves. Very good point, Mary. I will put that in the resources document I'm going to send out to folks. And someone asked, how do we feel COVID changed things? And I think that's a really, really good question. COVID absolutely kicked in the stomach startup food co-ops that were already organizing because how people organized changed. What people were willing to show up for, leave the house for, how you communicated. It put the brakes on a lot of people, and everyone was waiting to see what's going to happen. Also, interestingly, though, we were seeing, again, that 2017, we're seeing second wave style, third wave food co-ops, that's starting to slow a little. We saw the uptick go back up, not in the third wave style organizing, but funders were starting to lose interest. And funding goes through fads. Funders, you guys can call me out later about this, but I stand by it. Funding goes through fads, whether it's housing co-op, whether it's food, whether it's these different things, like social funding goes through fads. And it was moving away from food. And COVID really changed that. People saw in action how food co-ops were building a different food system where they were still accessing food, getting food into communities, and that how lack of food access communities that didn't have co-ops, didn't have alternative food distribution systems to rely on the hardship that they were put under. And so the focus came back to food. So it's definitely made things harder. And a lot of times people say, oh, it's taking 9, 10 years to organize, 12 years to organize a food co-op right now. We may find that to bear out, but before 2020, the average was 7 years. And some are quick as 4 years, some taking as long as 12. 7 was average. And I still think we're still yet to see if those food co-ops that started organizing after 2020 are really not going to go back to that being the average. So I think those are some of the impacts. I'm looking if there are other questions I missed. Okay. Is there any other questions I missed that people want to put in the chat before we wrap up today? Yes, and oh, great question, Suzette. What about the worker owner class showing up in the fourth wave inquiries? I wish I'd had time to notice it. I feel like, right, whiplash since 2020, there was a really powerful level of interest in what the hybrid or solidarity model of co-op ownership in startup grocery co-ops before 2020, meaning that there would not be just consumer owners, which is us, the customers of the stores, but also that they would be partially owned by worker co-ops, which are workers in the co-op. So that's called hybrid or solidarity model. And there was a lot, growing interest, conversations happening at the national conference level, interest, and I have not heard much about that since 2020. It's there. It's definitely still being discussed. And I would say it's being discussed most in Black-led food co-ops. They are definitely the torchbearers for that conversation. And Gem City Market is the first third wave co-op I know of that not only opened with bylaws for worker ownership, but activated them. That has been the challenge, and they activated them in the last year, year and a half, which is really amazing, and have active worker owners alongside their consumer owners. But the conversation seems like it's quieted down. Um, Angela, do I see any active P6 support of the fourth wave? I do. I think there's a lot of passion and interest in supporting it. And interestingly, existing second wave co-ops that are really kind of they're so busy running stores, they're out of touch, sometimes very out of touch with what's happening in the startup movement. But when they heard about Detroit, when they heard Detroit People's Food Co, when they heard about Gem City, they wanted to learn more, they wanted to support more, they wanted to know how to get involved. And certainly our overarching organizations in the movement have all worked with these co-ops and contributed to them. But I think that I think there's more hunger, and I think there should be, to be honest, even if it was self-preservation, which should not be the main reason. But honestly, when you look at the 1930s co-ops, the few that still survive today, because they adapted to what they were learning from the second wave food co-ops and became natural food stores predominantly. And so the reality is it's changing for all of us. The food industry is changing for all of us. It has been, it always will be. But there's a big thing, that's been going on with the natural food co-op industry and and we don't know where that's going. And I bet you where it's going is the fourth wave will be a good big piece of innovating and showing us where it's going. So it behooves us all, for many reasons, to be a huge supporter of fourth wave startup food co-ops. And I'm really glad that the industry continues to support Food Co-op Initiative to be here to support them as a new wave rises. And Durham and Central have multi-stakeholder. Yes, did Durham activate it? I know Durham wrote the bylaws, but please let me know if they activated it. I was not aware that they had activated it.
Well, they've had worker owners on the board since they opened, since they have workers.
Do they have though, is their share, what is the ownership? Is it they get one share and that share is the same value as the consumer share?
No, actually, it's a different value.
Okay.
So, and they're profitable, they actually would make more than a
Okay.
consumer.
Thank you, Jade. So it turns out I knew that Durham had it in their bylaws. I knew that they had waited till they stabilized to activate it, but I did not know they had actually activated those worker shares. So now that's two. And then Central, which I also, again, I am not the holder of all knowledge. So thank you for putting that forward. Jade Barker, by the way, who's you're hearing the voice right now, will be presenting another session later this week. That's a really important part of this conversation, which is just what is the grocery industry we're becoming part of and what's happening within it. And she's a treasure trove of knowledge. So please also check out her session. Other comments and questions? All right. Yes. Oh, yeah, exactly. And Suzette mentions that there are regional organizations like the Neighboring Food Co-op Association that came out of those second wave co-ops. So I think it's just an absolutely historic moment that we're all contributing to the movement together. And the fourth wave gets to define the fourth wave. I do think it started around 2016. And I do think we are at the point that it is crested. It is cresting over third wave organizing. And it behooves all of us to be supporting them and be doing everything we can to help them with what resources we have as they lead into finding solutions to the challenges that their communities are up against and that to a degree we're all up against, but them much more intensely. I'd like to take the last moment here to thank our sponsors. We could not do this without them. And this isn't one of those, oh, our sponsor, like, dude, these are cooperatives. These are cooperative businesses that model our values, who make this possible. They make it entirely free to the entire nation. We are so grateful to all y'all. And I real quickly just want to say, don't miss the rest of today. We put them all together for a reason. Rooted in Resistance with Alana Hines. If you're watching this later in recording, go find that video. It'll be in the same little playlist. Rooted in Resistance with Alana Hines is looking at the history of global majority food co-op, all kinds of food co-op, food cooperative organizing throughout the history of the US. We need this history. It's been disappearing and it absolutely informs what's happening today. And then one I'm just please do not miss Black Joy Rising, the fourth wave of Black co-op organizing. This is Black cooperative leadership from the third wave of food co-op organizing who have opened some of these fourth wave co-ops, talking about what is this wave, who's in it, what's its defining characteristics, speaking for themselves about what fourth wave Black food co-op organizing, which has been the largest portion of the fourth wave so far, what it is and what its future is. So, and there's course sessions for the rest of this week and all of next week. You can find them at fci.coop at FCI Live. And thank you all so much for being here with us.